Welcome back to the EcoVantage report. To be honest, if you stopped random people on the street a few days ago and asked them where the Strait of Hormuz is, most probably couldn't point to it on a map. But here's the interesting part. It might be one of the most important economic locations on Earth. Because just days ago, reports of a preliminary agreement between the United States and Iran and the prospect of reopening vital shipping routes sent oil prices sharply lower. Wall Street rallied. Investors breathed a sigh of relief, and trillions of dollars in global markets seemed to relax all at once. But why? After all, it's just a narrow stretch of water, right? Not exactly. In reality, this narrow passage may be one of the most important arteries of the modern global economy. Think of the world economy as a living organism. Factories are the muscles, ports are the organs, global trade is the bloodstream, and if the flow stops, the entire system feels the consequences. That's exactly the role the Strait of Hormuz plays. Roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply passes through this narrow corridor. A significant share of global liquefied natural gas exports moves through it as well. So when tensions rise in this region, the impact extends far beyond energy markets. It reaches transportation costs. It reaches supply chains. It reaches grocery stores. It reaches inflation. And eventually, it reaches your wallet. That's why investors have been watching this region so closely. Because during the recent tensions with Iran, the biggest fear wasn't necessarily war itself. It was the possibility that oil shipments could be disrupted. Modern economies run on energy. When energy becomes more expensive, almost everything becomes more expensive. And history has shown us exactly what happens when that occurs. Think back to the oil crises of the 1970s. Energy prices surged, inflation accelerated, central banks were forced to raise interest rates, economic growth slowed, and millions of households saw their cost of living increase dramatically. Today, we live in a world obsessed with artificial intelligence, cloud computing, and digital transformation. But despite all the technological progress, the global economy still depends on physical resources. And energy remains at the center of everything. Even the AI revolution depends on electricity. Data centers need power. Factories need power. Transportation networks need power. And much of that energy still relies on the uninterrupted movement of oil and gas around the world. That's why places like the Strait of Hormuz continue to matter far more than most people realize. According to reports from Reuters, financial markets welcomed signs of a potential agreement because investors viewed it as a positive development for global energy supplies. Oil prices declined, stock futures advanced, and market participants began pricing in a lower probability of a major energy shock. At first glance, that may sound like a small story. But financial markets see something much larger. Because oil prices are never just about oil. Oil prices influence inflation expectations. They influence central bank policy. They influence corporate profits. They influence consumer spending. And ultimately, they influence economic growth itself. In other words, when oil moves, the entire economy pays attention. But there is another question worth asking. Are investors right to celebrate? Maybe. But not entirely. Because as multiple reports have pointed out, this agreement is not a permanent solution. Many of the underlying geopolitical tensions remain unresolved. The Middle East continues to be one of the most strategically sensitive regions in the world. And energy markets can change direction with a single headline. Today, investors may be optimistic. Tomorrow, a new development could completely alter expectations. That distinction is important. Markets aren't celebrating because all risks have disappeared. They're celebrating because the worst-case scenario may have been avoided, for now. And perhaps that's the biggest lesson in this story. The most important economic locations on Earth aren't always financial centers. Sometimes they aren't New York. Sometimes they aren't London. Sometimes they aren't Shanghai. Sometimes the fate of global markets depends on a narrow waterway in the Middle East, because the global economy isn't built solely on financial systems. It's built on physical systems too. It's built on energy. It's built on shipping routes. It's built on ports. It's built on infrastructure. And sometimes it's built on a stretch of water only a few miles wide. That's why investors will continue watching the Strait of Hormuz. Energy companies will continue watching it. Governments will continue watching it. And central banks will continue watching it. Because if the engine of the global economy is going to keep running, the fuel has to keep moving. And for now, one of the most important pathways for that fuel remains the Strait of Hormuz. If you value the truth beyond the headlines, subscribe to the EcoVantage report. Stay curious, stay informed, and we'll see you in the next deep dive.